The Moon Pool by Abraham Merritt. So this book was copyright 1919, and I have this kind of interesting Collier Books edition that's in really good shape. This was printed in the 70s, from what I can tell on the copyright page. This is the first book I've read from Merritt, and I would call this a adventure, lost world, lost civilization type books that has some horror, a lot of fantasy, and a few science fiction elements to it. Now, I'm in no way an expert in this kind of storytelling and what this book really influenced. Some writers like H.P. Lovecraft, I know this was very influential in Dungeons and Dragons. It's part of their Appendix N. And so take everything I say with a grain of salt. This is more coming from a traditional science fiction reader and giving this one a shot. Now, overall, I'm glad I read this, but I really struggled with parts of it. I think to kind of understand some of the struggle, you kind of need to know a little bit about Abraham Merritt. So I did some, digging before I read this one and afterwards. And it kind of makes a lot of sense when you kind of put it into perspective about Abraham Merritt as a person and when this was written and what he was trying to accomplish with it and why that was kind of a challenge for me. So Abraham Merritt was American, and he was a very successful, I think, editor for a magazine or newspaper or something like that. And he liked to travel with a lot of his money. So apparently he traveled all over the world. And at this time, there wasn't a lot of photography. There was really no video footage of anything. And so he really it sounds like he wanted to share some of these experiences and write some of this travel into his stories. And so you get a lot of descriptive writing in this book. And I don't know if this is common with his later works. This was Abraham Merritt's first published novel, and it started out as a short story. From what I can tell, I think the first 5 chapters of this was called The Moon Pool, and then he later came back and kind of wrote some more onto the end of that one and turned it into a novel. But that was a lot of the challenge, was just the really descriptive narrative style. And it makes sense. A lot of people never traveled to the South Pacific where a lot of this novel takes place. And so he describes a lot of elements. And then when he gets into the fantasy part of the book, he really describes a lot of elements there. And I tell you, the guy had an imagination. I also found out he was into some interesting horticulture. He would grow orchids, and from what I saw online, he grew marijuana and peyote. So kind of makes a little bit more sense of how his imagination worked, because I'll tell you, man, the guy had quite the imagination when you get into this lost world that's all underground with this whole civilization and their whole society that's going on with it. But I guess we'll just go ahead and talk about the plot a little bit. Like I said, don't take anything that I say here too seriously. I did struggle to keep my attention focused, but I got most of the plot and understood most of what was going on. So our main character, his name was Goodwin. And in the beginning of the book, he meets up with kind of an acquaintance of his, and his name was Throckmorton. And Throckmorton's in distress, and Goodwin doesn't know why, and Throckmorton basically, in a data dump type way, but it was done well. He explains this whole story about down there, and this takes place in the South Pacific. I forget the area, but it's almost like the lost city of Atlantis. There's a similar kind of legend down in this area of the world. And so Throckmorton, he had found this place, kind of touring around these ruins, and there was this big stone doorway there. And when they approached it, they couldn't figure out a way to open it, but when the moon came up at a certain time, the thing would just kind of open up on its own. And members of his party kind of kept disappearing into this thing, to where he was basically the last one left, and he wanted to go there and try to figure out what happened to them. And so this intrigues Goodwin, our main character. And so they kind of organize a little party, and they kind of get another little team together to go down there and investigate this. And when they get down there, Throckmorton is the first one that gets kind of taken into this doorway. And then the story progresses. We have a whole group that Goodwin's kind of in charge of, that they enter this area, and this moon pool concept is kind of like a portal in a way, and they even call it a portal. And from what I understand, this was some of the first fiction that really described a portal where you can go through this portal in and out from kind of our normal world into some fantasy world. Now, the beginning of the novel, this whole setup had a lot of horror elements to it, and I really did like that part. I think if I just read the short story, which was basically the first 5 chapters of this book, I probably would have a lot better overall, regard for this one. But once the story progresses, kind of past the 5th chapter, you go down into this underworld where there's this lost civilization, and it gets elaborate. There's a lot of adventure. We have frogmen and dwarves and this kind of spirit-like entity, and there's a lot that goes on, and there's a lot of adventure. But I really struggled to keep my attention and my focus of everything that was going on, and I think had partly to do with this really descriptive writing style. And it also kind of had to do with the characters. They were maybe just a little flat from some other books I've read maybe in this genre. And so, and that's kind of where I want to talk about a book that I've recently read that apparently started the whole Lost World genre, was Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, The Lost World. Now, this book came out before The Moon Pool. But what I really liked about this book was this character, Professor Challenger, who's the main character in this story. And I don't know if it's all intentionally funny. I'm sure there was some intentional humor, but as a modern reader reading that story, that character, Professor Challenger, I was constantly engaged in the story, and I really enjoyed that. It was way better than I thought it was going to be. And when I found out this was kind of another Lost World type novel set in a completely different setting down here in the South Pacific, I was pretty intrigued. But, in the end, it was a really kind of a struggle for me to get through this one. So, I'm glad I read it. I can see a lot of the influence. The guy had a heck of an imagination. I will definitely give him that. And, I don't know that I would go back and read any of his other novels at this point. I know this was his first novel. I think he did get a little bit better of a writer, but it's just not a subgenre, a subset of science fantasy or whatever you want to call it. Even H.P. Lovecraft, I've always had a trouble getting into a lot of his work. So if you're really interested in this, there's way better videos where people can break down more of what's going on, and people who have a passion for this kind of work. But this is part of this series that I'm doing, and I'm not going to DNF any of them. I powered through it, so just stay tuned to see what my next video review comes out. And once again, thanks for watching.